Hello, everyone. Welcome to this yet another exciting BSWG KOL. Today, we will have the two chairs, co-leads of the medical outreach team of the BSWG to discuss their work. Before we start, I want to say some housekeeping items. Please leave your camera off and unmute during the presentation. After the presentation, we will have time to take questions. At that time, you can unmute yourself and turn your camera on. Let me introduce our speakers. We have Jennifer Clark, is a lead mathematical statistician at the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, with 10 years of experience in drug regulatory reviews across a range of different areas. Her current work is in cardiology and nephrology, with research interests in digital health technology and Bayesian methodology. Ross Bray, our second speaker, is a senior research advisor at Eli Lilly and Company with 10 years of experience in diabetes drug development, with experience across both early and late phase clinical trials. So without further ado, I will pass the microphone to Jennifer.
All right, thanks, Rita. I will see. Can you guys see my screen, Frida?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I guess this is basically results from the Bayesian Scientific Working Group education outreach team that Ross and I have been co-leading. And so let me see. So I guess first the disclaimer that this presentation just reflects the views of this working group and not any other associations. So I guess just to start out about who we are part of the Bayesian Scientific Working Group that Frida currently leads out. We are the medical outreach team. And so we started out a number of years ago with the objective to enhance understanding of Bayesian methods with the vision to ensure that Bayesian methods are well understood and utilized where appropriate for design and analysis throughout the medical product development process. So what we actually look like, we are actually a pretty diverse group with individuals from academia, industry, and just regulatory authorities. So we have a really nice diverse viewpoints which leads to really great discussions in our meetings. And we've been able to put together different work outputs, such as this survey that we were able to publish, and we'll be going over some of the results today. So this survey, when we designed it, it was designed mainly for medical researchers and specifically non-statisticians. And so we had multiple kind of objectives that we wanted to look into in this survey. So the first two I'll be going over, and those are some of the perceived barriers to implementing Bayesian methods, and also kind of the audience members' preferences for increasing their comfort in using these methods. The second part Ross will be going over, and this is the audience interpretation of frequentist results. So we gave some examples he'll be going over and asked them to interpret the frequentist results, and then also the interpretation of the Bayesian results from this made-up example. So we were able to publish these results in a special issue of TIRS, which is Therapeutic Innovation in Regulatory Science. And we, based off of the results that we found, we gave some recommendations in these two papers that we wrote from the survey. And we'll be giving those at the end of our presentation as well. But in the based off of kind of what we found in the preferences for increased comfort, we thought it might be a good idea to actually turn and just instead of just publishing the survey results, turn it into a collection of articles on Bayesian methods. And so that ended up being 6 articles. So we had kind of a tutorial article that just introduced some concepts and some examples. And there were several regulatory articles that we were lucky enough to get to have in the series as well, expressing just what's been done within both CEDAR, CBER, and also kind of compiling CDRH's experience, since they were one of the first centers to kind of come up with some guidance on using Bayesian methods. They kind of give a look back, and we were lucky enough to actually get Dr. Greg Campbell to lead that and work with him a little bit in that article. Unfortunately, Dr. Campbell very recently passed away, but our group was lucky enough to get to learn from him and get a lot of his expertise, which is published now in this article that he let out. And then we also have a article on rare diseases, which there's a fair amount of Bayesian methods that have been used in this, and also in pediatrics. But I think there might be actually a separate, not associated with us, pediatrics series that's been published in the past, and I believe they kind of might have some articles on pediatric trials that have used Bayesian methods.
Hey, Jennifer, I'm really sorry to interrupt. I
Sure.
just got a note saying that this meeting will end in 10 minutes because I do have some issues with my Zoom account. So just a note to everybody on the call. If the meeting ended, please click the same link and I will restart the meeting immediately. It should be fine, I think. I do apologize for the technical difficulties.
Okay, thank you, Frida. So I guess just going through materials and methods. This survey was just 22 questions for medical researchers specifically involved in clinical trials. This included academics, pharmaceutical companies, CROs, and regulatory institutions. There were basically 3 different sections. The first section was just looking at demographics, the educational background, and so just to understand who was taking this survey. And then the next 2 pieces were the parts that we were really wanting to look into further, is the perceived barriers and just preferences for becoming more comfortable with Bayesian methods, and then the interpretation of both classical and Bayesian analysis results. So we estimated we sent this out to approximately 1,600 people. And of those, we had 323 respondents. And so one big limitation we do have to flag on this was it was given in December of 2019, which is, of course, before COVID really hit and all the restrictions came down. So it's definitely a very different world from when we gave this survey, but we kind of tried to factor that into our interpretation of the results, which you'll see later. So just some of the results we have. These are the demographics of the survey takers. So you can see most of them were MDs or PhDs, which is kind of who we were envisioning as being the main people taking it. They actually had a pretty good number of years of experience, with most having at least 10 years of experience since their degree was completed. And many of them came from CROs or pharma companies. And we also had a really good regulatory response rate as well, you can see there. And then in terms of work roles, a lot of them were research scientists or regulatory reviewers and study leads or medical monitors. And most surprisingly had some previous Bayesian training, close to 58%. But also, I guess, unsurprisingly, most had very little comfort in actually interpreting these Bayesian results. So I guess we wanted to get some audience participation in this. So we have a poll we'd like folks to take. If you can either, here, I'll put it up here so we can see in real time. You can either go to menti.com and use this code here. get to the poll and vote, or you can take a picture if you have a smartphone and go use the code here to go and you can kind of, this is the barriers question that we asked folks in the survey to rank. You can just rank the only one of the ones that are relevant for you. And then we can sort of see how that stacks up against what we saw in our survey. And I will say that we kind of expect these would be somewhat different since it looks like some people are starting to take it now. But we were thinking this, you guys might be different since you are, we would expect you guys to be more of a statistical audience versus the non-statistical audience. So I'll give you guys a minute to weigh in on this. I'll go ahead and come back in. Looks like a lot of people have weighed in. And you guys can keep on voting. The poll will stay open even when I go back to the presentation. But interesting, looks like the lack of clarity, our guidance from regulators is coming as your top choice for folks here who are, it looks like there's about 30 people. They're taking the poll. And then insufficient knowledge of Bayesian approaches is second on these choices. And I will say the other option we had in the survey that we sent out had a write-in option that we looked into, but here we don't have the means of having a write-in. But feel free to add something to the chat if you have something that's not listed here that you'd like to bring up. But and feel free if you haven't finished ranking to continue with that. But going back to the presentation, here we can see the perceived barriers within the one that the survey we sent out for the non-statisticians. Knowledge was by far considered the top choice in perceived barriers. It's if you look at just the top ranking, those who ranked it as the #1 barrier, and then is a top 2 barrier, it's still the #1, and is a top 3 barrier, which is this full bar here. It's still the top choice. And this is followed by the lack of guidance from regulators, which actually it looks like with the statistical audience, this is actually reversed. So that that's interesting to note. So so here we just sort of the take-home messages we got from those results, the insufficient knowledge, and then having when we looked at previous Bayesian training, what surprised us was can you it says it's been disabled, Frida, for screen sharing.
I forgot to do that. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No worries.
Try again.
Okay. All right. Can you see it, Frida?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. So I guess one thing that was a little surprising was that having previous Bayesian training, didn't seem to make much difference in these perceived barriers. So here you can see we tried to make these dot plots similar to the overall plot before. Just look, you can see here those who had no training versus those who did have some. They're pretty much right on top, and they both ranked knowledge is the number one perceived barrier. We did note, and this is not in the results, but we did see that there was the lack of knowledge seemed to be less important when those whose previous training was in a graduate course in Bayesian methods. So that was something interesting and might be useful. Could reach out to graduate programs to see to determine what makes them more successful than perhaps other trainings that maybe aren't as useful. But yeah, that would be a future topic maybe in actually putting together those courses. So looking at by phase 3 work, whether the perceived barriers if you worked in phase 3 clinical trials or not. It seemed like if you look at the regulatory barrier, it was slightly stronger perception, but again, it was not terribly different for those who had phase 3 work versus those who didn't. And again, you can kind of see the rankings are pretty much the same, just the strength of the perception can sometimes change a little bit. And so apologies, this is a very busy plot, but when we looked at it by actual work organizations, the rankings again weren't terribly different. They were all pretty much still knowledge is number one. You can see those who were in pharma seem to be a little more, little less strongly inclined on the knowledge barrier, and it was more closely aligned with the perceived regulatory barrier. So these were just some of the results by work organizations, and then, but some of them we didn't get a whole lot of responders in some of these, so that should be taken in consideration. So before moving on, we have another poll if others would like to look into that. It looks like some have already taken it, but you can kind of see in real time if you want to weigh in on this. This was the other question of interest we had for the statisticians involved in clinical trials. What would make you more comfortable using a Bayesian design and analysis on a primary objective in a clinical trial? So if you want to go through and rank as few or as many as you'd like of these options, and then we can kind of see how well this aligns with the non-statistical audience and their perceptions on what would make them more comfortable. I'll give folks a minute or so to weigh in on this. So it looks like we have 20 people, or 22 people now in the poll potentially taking it. I'll say these results are a little surprising for those of us who have seen the results from our original survey. It looks like actually close collaborations between clinical statisticians and medical teams for a project is the top choice, and which is different from what we saw from the non-statistical survey takers in our original survey. But results from our last survey come with a lot of big caveats because of the changes that occurred because of COVID-19. Yeah, I'll move that. Feel free to continue ranking if you would like to continue on that survey. But here you can see actually our top two choices by quite a bit. There was a strong preference for just in-person training at a workshop or conference, or something just internal in-person at the organization. And then second, which was online training with Q&A and slides and recordings available. So we do think that these are probably going to be the top two that could have been preferences could have changed as a result of changes from the pandemic. But we did see that this was, if you look at just the #1 ranking alone, that even the second of the online training, it still very much outweighs it when you take in first and second rankings for that, for the online preference. So we thought this would probably still be a strong preference, but again, there's the big caveat that that would have changed. And I guess you can see the sorry, I'm looking back at the poll that everyone's taking here. The clinical collaborations, that was third here on this survey, and that was first here with the kind of statistical audience. So I guess that's something, it could be, we're not sure, that could be changes from the pandemic, or it could be differences between statistical preferences and non-statistician preferences in learning. But it seems like statisticians maybe prefer more collaborative learning versus a kind of more classroom regimented learning. So I guess just summarizing, for this survey, non-statisticians in-person training was the top choice, but again, the COVID-19 preferences probably changed, and I think it would be interesting if were able to survey the same folks to see how that preference would have changed, or if it changed at all. But I think that would be outside the realm of feasibility at this point. So just kind of breaking it down by previous Bayesian training, we can see in terms of the rankings here, they were relatively unchanged by previous training, but there was a stronger preference for in-person workshops amongst those who didn't have any Bayesian training before, which you can see here. It's just a stronger, higher percentage. So when looking at it by phase 3 work, again, it wasn't very different, but again, you have a higher percentage for a workshop for those who do have phase 3 work. And then looking at, again, by work organizations, we did notice, interestingly, CROs, those in pharma and regulatory, again, had stronger preferences for the workshops. You can see here those in medical practice or in academia, their preferences were actually not terribly different from an online preference, which are percentage-wise is closer. So that was something we thought was interesting, given that academics at least would probably be more used to in-person type learning situations. So just in summary of our recommendations from this, we do think there's a need for education on Bayesian methods with guidance from competent authorities. So based off of what we saw, introductory training for medical researchers presented through an in-person workshop that could also be broadcast online with live Q&A for those who prefer not to meet in person. And it seems like this seems to have actually become more the norm in general for a lot of learning courses that are being offered, just not just in Bayesian, but just in general. So that's I think the infrastructure for this has just come leaps and bounds for over the past couple of years. And then there were stronger preferences for online training or a collaborative project amongst those with previous Bayesian training. So that might also get to what we saw here with this statistical audience with you guys. So that might be useful for higher level training. So perhaps those non-statisticians that we work with who have some training, maybe it could be useful for us to start working with them on collaborative projects where we work more one-on-one with them. So with that, I will stop sharing and let my co-presenter Ross Bray take over, and he will be going over the second part of the survey.
All right, thanks, Jennifer. Can let me know that you can see my slides, please.
Yes, we can see it. It's not in presenter mode though.
All right, perfect. Okay, well, yeah, thanks, Jennifer. I'm going to continue on with the survey, with the portion of the survey that talked about or that asked about interpreting statistics. So frequentist, the p-value, and the confidence interval, and Bayesian, the posterior probability, and the credible interval. We wanted to include this in the survey to allow sort of to try and understand, how well is there an understanding of these statistics. I think initially we were interested in the Bayesian statistic interpretations, but in order to give good perspective, we wanted to add in the frequentist as well. We decided to include a short scenario in the survey where we defined a clinical trial, gave some results, and then asked, based on the results, said, how do you interpret these results? We did think of this as a potentially something that could be considered intimidating for somebody who's trying to take a survey. And so one thing that we did in the survey to try and sort of maybe get rid of some of those fears is, prior to giving the scenario and the interpretation questions, we said, after we give you these questions, we're going to give you the answers to the questions, so that hopefully it could then be treated more like a learning opportunity rather than just like a test. It also allowed us to, once we gave the correct responses, to then ask questions about preferences on what the interpretations of each of the statistics are. So do you prefer a p-value interpretation, or do you prefer a posterior probability interpretation? So I have the results of those questions here as well. So I'll start with introducing the short scenario that we gave in the survey. We said that we had a proof of concept clinical trial and that we were designing, along with the results of a prior single-arm pilot study. We said that the single-arm study had a treatment where 7 of 10 patients responded. The POC study, we had a sample size of 20 patients with a null hypothesis that the response rate of the drug is less than or equal to 50%. And then after running that POC study, 11 out of the 55 patients responded, resulting in frequentist results of a p-value of 0.41 and a confidence interval ranging from 0.35 all the way up to 1. So we gave this portion of the scenario, then we asked them to interpret the p-value and the confidence interval. I'm going to wait on giving the results of that until after I introduce what we said for the Bayesian portion of this. For the Bayesian portion, we then said, we're now going to use that single arm study as the prior distribution and the POC study as the new data. And combining those two together using Bayesian methods, we arrive at this posterior distribution, and you can see all three here listed on the plot. Within the plot, we also shaded the area to the right of 0.5 and gave that area as 0.87, and then stated to the in the survey that the area under the posterior curve greater than 0.5 is equal to 0.87, which is the posterior probability, although we didn't use the term posterior probability in the survey itself for that question. And then we also stated that the 95% posterior credible interval for the response rate ranged between 0.42 and 0.76. So there's a lot of text here. These were the questions that we asked. How do you interpret the p-value of 0.41? And then you have the options that were given. Similarly for the confidence interval, posterior probability, and the credible interval. Note that for each of these questions, there was an additional option E that said none of the above, and option F that said choose not to answer. And as we get to the results, you'll see that there are some people who just didn't answer. So we have some NAs there also. You can see the way that we attempted to give some different formatting to the responses. For example, on the p-value, the options were the probability your drug has a response rate greater than 50% is 0.41, which of course is the way that you would interpret a posterior probability that we see down below. Probability that your drug has a response rate of 50% or less is 0.41. If the null is true, the probability of incorrectly rejecting the null is 0.41. And then the correct response, if the null is true and we repeat the study, the probability is 0.41 that at least 11 patients will respond. So I'm not going to read all the other questions here, but I think one thing that we'll talk about later is, basing this as a multiple choice does allow for somebody to, use some logic to try and find what's the correct answer, especially as you see all these questions together. But I think it still gives us a good representation. I guess the other thing that you might be concerned about is, because we in the survey told them that they would be getting the correct answer after taking these questions. Potentially somebody could have gone past the questions, looked at the answers, and come back and answered correctly. We think that's unlikely, and I'm going to move to results now based on the percentages of people that we saw answering these questions correctly. So here you're looking at each of the four questions, the results for each of the four questions. Plot A is the results of the question on the p-value. B is the confidence interval. C is the posterior probability. D is the credible interval. I think the first thing I want to point out is if you look at the option F and option NA for all of these questions, there are lots and lots of people choosing not to respond or just not responding at all. So the p-value and the confidence interval have similar non-response rates of close to 25%. And then as you look at the Bayesian results, it's even higher. We're over 30% in those questions. So I think that by itself tells us there's a lot of uncertainty in interpreting these results. And so that maybe is something that, as Jennifer mentioned, education would help us to do better there. But now looking at the actual questions and the correct responses. The correct responses are outlined in the green boxes. You can see for the p-value, only 11.5% of respondents answered that correctly. Very, very, very low. The confidence interval, we had about 24% respond correctly. The posterior probability, we had 42%, and the Bayes, we had about 37%. Now, as members of the sub-team or of the team in the Bayesian Scientific Working Group, we would like to rejoice at the increased correct responses in the Bayesian questions. I'm not sure that that's necessarily appropriate here. I'll talk a little bit later about some of the reasons maybe behind that, but I think maybe just the first one is that question about using a multiple choice test and allowing people to use logic to try and come at the correct answer, and also thinking about the context of the survey, knowing that we're asking about Bayesian results, which probably implies that Bayesian results are more intuitive, which in this case they are, resulting in higher correct answers. But even with that, even if you believe that the Bayes results are better, they're still really low percentages, only 42% and 37%. So we've got lots of responses spread out fairly evenly across the other options, and I think just backs up that idea that there's a lot of uncertainty in interpreting these results, whether it's a frequentist or a Bayesian result. I'm also going to move on to looking at a couple of different subgroups. This one is the same results you just looked at by those who self-reported a subgroup of comfort level interpreting Bayesian analyses. So they had the option of saying little to no comfort. They have some comfort with Bayesian methods, but not in interpreting results, or they are comfortable interpreting. I think important point here, as you look at the correct responses highlighted in green, in each of those cases, those who said that they were uncomfortable interpreting Bayesian results answered those questions correctly. So that is as you would expect, and by the level of comfort. So the some but not interpreting is next, followed by the little to no comfort. That all makes sense. We still don't have really good results even in those who have comfort interpreting. And you may remember from our demographics slide, only 8% of people said that they were comfortable interpreting. So we have a very small portion of our population who is comfortable interpreting, and that small population is doing better, still not great, but better. Whereas 34% said they had some comfort, but not in interpreting, and 57% said they had little to no comfort interpreting results. This is subgrouping by previous Bayesian training. Again, this sort of makes sense. Those with some previous training are across the board on all four questions answering correctly more often than those who did not have any training. Again, just for context here, those who had some training represent about 58% of the respondents, and those without training are 42%. Okay, so after the interpretation questions, we then, as I mentioned, we gave the respondents the correct interpretation for each of the statistics. And we asked them which statistic they felt was more useful for decision making. So we asked two questions. One was the p-value versus the posterior probability. The second was the confidence interval or the credible interval. And here are the results of that. I think this confirmed our expectation for the survey. I think that's one of the reasons that we try and promote the use of Bayesian methods in our working group. We feel that the ability to interpret those results is a lot simpler. So 66% of respondents thought the posterior probability was more useful than the p-value. About 22% thought the p-value was more useful. As far as the credible interval, 60% thought that was more useful for as compared to the confidence interval, where 29% thought that was more useful. And we still have over 10% either not answering, or I think other here referred to some free text responses that they decided they wanted to put rather than choosing one or the other. Again, subgrouping by the level of comfort interpreting Bayesian results. And again, I think this makes sense. Those who have comfort interpreting are more likely to prefer the Bayesian posterior probability or the credible interval over the p-value or the confidence interval. And again, by levels of training, those who had some training also are more likely to prefer the Bayesian statistic over the frequentist. Okay, so that's the end of the results from the survey. I do want to talk some more about some limitations and discussion and conclusion here. I think the key limitation here is the response rate less than 20%, which isn't very good. I think thinking about survey analysis in general, we think that the interpretation of this response rate is that it's limited to medical researchers who are motivated to respond, either just to surveys in general, or potentially they were interested in the topic of Bayesian statistics. Of course, I guess if that is the case, even if that is the case, they're still not Bayesian enthusiasts based on the results that we saw. So because many had little or no comfort with the methodology. There's also, as you consider the survey itself and how you might then move forward with trying to implement changes in the medical or the clinical community, there's really no set standard for what constitutes a substantial evidence of effectiveness within these methods. And so that's something that wasn't really addressed in the survey, and we would have to do other things to try and address that or to get at that. And even if we did have substantial evidence, the implementation of these results does require some more specific scientific or statistical and computational expertise that's not always as prevalent in the community. Also, specifically for the scenario and the interpretation of the statistics that we presented, I think a limitation is, since the comparison was only on interpretation of final statistical outputs, it doesn't really address whether there are other objections to using Bayesian methods. One example is choosing a prior, and that's something that I know that we hear a lot. Going back to the results, as I mentioned, for the frequentist statistics, we had about 12% answer correctly on the p-value, 24% on the confidence interval. This actually aligns with prior publications that shows confusion surrounding significance testing. And that's not even only on a non-statistical audience. I know that the Bayesian Scientific Working Group had a team that presented a similar survey with results published in, I think, 2014, that showed even in a statistical community that the confusion is high around significance testing. I think also the nearly 25% of respondents that either skipped or selected choose not to answer continues to indicate really significant uncertainty in interpreting these results. For Bayesian statistics, we did have higher correct responses, with 42% answering the posterior probability correctly and 37% answering the credible interval. This could indicate a better understanding of Bayesian interpretation, but as I mentioned before, some of the other factors may have influenced the results here that that this may be a little bit misleading. And this also had a higher percentage of respondents that either didn't respond or chose not to answer. So in any case, I think there's definitely not a high level of certainty or understanding of interpreting statistical results. Conclusion, I agree with Jennifer here. We need more educational opportunities, and not only in Bayesian statistics, which is necessary to increase the level of understanding, but even in conventional statistics, there's certainly not a high level of understanding there either. I think also, as I know there's a movement to reduce the use of p-values and promote the use of effect sizes and differences. That also could be incorporated into this type of educational opportunity. And then finally, I think the usefulness questions, is the p-value, the posterior, more useful? Is the confidence interval or the credible interval more useful? I think that confirmed our expectation that Bayesian statistics are easier to interpret. that's definitely a takeaway that we had from the survey. I'm going to step slightly away here and just talk a little bit about the medical outreach team that we've been working with. We kind of have wrapped up the survey portion of this and published the output. There's ongoing work there. I think the focus now is more on trying to contribute to providing educational opportunities. And one way that we were able to do that recently was an educational session that was provided at the DIA annual meeting in June on Bayesian statistics. I think Frida and Jennifer were the co-instructors of that course. There's currently some work contributing to the creation of a Bayesian education course with the plan to be presented at the University of California at San Francisco. It's led by Steve Ruberg. That is, I think both of these educational things were targeted at non-statisticians. And then also there's new leadership in the medical outreach team. Jennifer and I are, as of this month, planning to step down and take a little bit of a backseat role there. So we are sort of in the process of trying to define a direction to take in how we provide these educational opportunities. If anybody's interested in contributing to that, you can contact the new co-leads, Natalia or Purvi, using their email addresses here. And just as a last thing, I want to acknowledge the Bayesian Scientific Working Group as a whole. There's a lot of people involved there. We've received a lot of support, both from the members of our sub-team as well as from the overall working group. And then last, just a big thank you to the members of the medical outreach sub-team. There's a lot of work that has gone on in the background here. We could not have done this without those of you we've listed here, and thank you for all the work there. I have a couple references, but go ahead and open it up for questions if there are any.
I just want to mention that I can't see our remaining time was only 6 minutes. I don't know how many people can see that on top of the screen. If the discussion past 6 minutes, we can certainly dial back in again and continue the discussion. I do apologize for the technical difficulties. So if anybody from the audience have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself, or you can type in your questions in the chat. I do not see any questions in the chat.
So I've got a question. Often, so I work at a CRO, so often we're given a protocol, and then that protocol drives the analyses that we write up for the SAP. So typically it's a big pain to go back and revise the protocol if we wanted to update to a Bayesian method, because almost always the protocols I see are frequentist analyses. At what point do you think it would be worthwhile to push back on that or try to get it? I mean, I guess we can always amend or whatever have you, but I'm wondering at what point it's useful to try to drive that at the CRO level, or maybe it's not worth it and we need to more focus on during protocol writing.
Yeah, I can. I don't know if I have a great answer here. I haven't personally worked at a CRO, so I'm not sure of the level of freedom you have to do something like that. I would say if you were going to push back on it, you probably need to be supported by, case examples or something where you can show, hey, this is an example of something that's different from what you're planning, but gets you similar results, and we think better results. Because I think it would be difficult probably to just suggest a method that maybe the sponsor is not familiar with and expect them to change to that.
Thanks, sir.
there any other questions? If there's no questions, I do want to say really appreciative of Ross and Jennifer's work for the medical outreach sub-team and the contribution to the Bayesian Scientific Working Group. This is just wonderful work. And I wish everybody a great weekend, and really thank you for your participation of the KOLs. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Frida.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Frida.
Ross.
Thanks,
Jennifer.
everybody.
Yep,
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.